Hello, dear friends. Parshat chukat. And these are some things that I said here in Loon Lake, New York, where I am now in the Adirondacks. And I'd like to talk a little bit about Miriam. In this week's parshat says, and the children of Israel, even the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Midbar Tzin in the first month. And the people abode in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. This week's parsha, Miriam dies, and so does Aaron. And there was no water for the congregation. And they assembled themselves together against Moses and against Aaron. And the people strove with Moses, saying, even if we would have perished, would that we have perished when our brethren perished before God? Why have you brought the assembly of God into the wilderness to die there, we and our cattle? And wherefore have you made us to come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It is not a place of seed, of figs, of vines, of pomegranates, neither is any water to drink. And Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly into the tent of the meeting, the Mishkan, fell upon their faces, and the glory of God appeared to them. What exactly is happening here? Miriam passes away. According to our tradition, Miriam, by the merit of Miriam, the Jewish people had water in the desert. The Talmud says that by the merit of Moses, we had the manna, the nourishment. By the merit of Aaron, Aharon, we had the Ananei HaKavod, the divine protection over the Jewish people. By the merit of Miriam, there was water. What does this mean? Moses is the one who teaches the path and the direction. He's like the nourishment, both physical and spiritual, to the people. He's the leader who shows direction. Aaron is the man of peace. As it says in the Ethics of the Fathers, be like the students of Aaron, who love peace and seek peace. And supposedly, according to the rabbis, Aaron would be a peacemaker. If we saw people arguing, he would try to settle their problems and get them somehow to relinquish their strife and come to some type of settlement. So he was the man of peace. And when there is peace and unity between the Jewish people, there's also divine protection. And Miriam, the one through her merit, was the water. What does that mean? The Be'erah Miriam, which literally means the fountain of Miriam, the wellspring of Miriam, means both water and water that comes out of the ground, which is like a spring. And water is both a symbol of life and the symbol of birth, of new life. It's a sustenance of life, and it's the new life. If we look in the story of Miriam, we find 5 stations in that story. The first station is Miriam turning to her father, according to the Talmud, according to the Midrash. And after Pharaoh said not to have that any male sons of the Jewish people would be killed. So Amram and Yocheved decided not to have children. Why take a chance? If there's a male, they might be killed by Pharaoh. And Miriam, according to the Midrash, who was 5 years old at the time, came over to her father and said, look, Pharaoh decreed against the males, and you're decreeing even against the females. How can you do such a thing? Amram agreed, and he and Yocheved had a child, and the child was a son and was Moses. According to the Midrash, and Rashi brings this is part 2. Miriam receives prophecy, and she says that this boy is going to be the Redeemer of Israel. But after 3 months, they couldn't hide him anymore, and they put him into the bulrushes of the Nile. And the father said to Miriam, what about your prophecy? And it says that she Vatetatzav achoto merachok, his sister, meaning Moses' sister, stood from afar to see what would happen to him and what would happen to her prophecy. And then, of course, as we know, Pharaoh's daughter comes with her maidens, and they find Moses in the bulrushes in the Nile and take him. And right away, Miriam walks over and says, "Should I find you somebody among the Hebrew women who can wean this child and bring him up?" Pharaoh's daughter agrees, and of course, she brings Yocheved, the mother, to be the one to wean the child, to nurse the child. So this is the second story of Miriam. Then we see again in the story in the Bible of Shifra and Puah, the midwives, the Hebrew midwives, who Pharaoh tells them to be midwives to the Hebrews and make sure that the first son dies. But the midwives say to Pharaoh, by the time they couldn't do it, because by the time they reached the Hebrew women, they had already given birth. They do it naturally, just like the animals. Those chayot is also like the Aramaic word chayata, which means they are like midwives themselves. According to the Midrash, and Rashi brings this Shifra and Puah were Yocheved, the mother of Moses, and Miriam, the daughter, the sister of Moses, the daughter of Yocheved, sister of Moses. So again, we see Miriam. Now let's backtrack for a moment. The first time we meet Miriam, she's convincing her father to have a child, to bring life into the world. The second time, she's next to the Nile, next to the water, after the birth of Moses. And the third time, she's now acting like a midwife, bringing children into the world and making sure that Pharaoh's decree does not happen and that life is not stopped. Where do we see her in the fourth case? After the Jewish people leave Egypt and are now born as a nation, we were a tribe who came into the 70 people who came into Egypt, and we leave Egypt as a nation, and the nation is born going through the Red Sea, crossing the waters, almost like the breaking of the waters of a birth of a child. And as soon as that happens, there's Miriam, and she is singing with the women, singing and dancing after the men. So again, it's Miriam with the water, with the birth of the Jewish people. This will now explain the fifth time that we meet Miriam in the Bible with the unusual story. It says that Miriam was talking to Aaron about the Ethiopian wife that Moses had taken. Now Rashi explains, what does it mean the Ethiopian wife that he was taken? It's referring to Tzipporah, his wife. What does it mean who he had taken in past tense? He had left his wife. Now Miriam didn't know that God told him to leave his wife. So she says to Aaron, why is this Moses leaving his wife? We're also prophets. God spoke to us. We didn't have to leave our spouses. Why is Miriam talking? Because she's nervous. She's doing the same thing she did to her father. She said to her father, why are you leaving Yocheved not to have children? That's not what Jews do. When she's talking about Moses, she's actually talking to Aaron and say, should I tell him directly that this is not a good idea? That it looks bad that the top leader left his wife? What about the whole idea of bringing the new generation in that's going to come to Israel? It's not that Moses didn't have children. He had Gershon and Eliezer, but this seems to be what Miriam does. But here was a no-no, because Miriam didn't know that God told Moses not to do this. And God appears suddenly to Miriam and Aharon and says, and I'm of course saying it in my own words, how dare you speak that way to Moses, my servant? B'chol beiti ne'emanu, he is faithful in my house. Pel daberbo, and I speak to him directly. He's on a whole different level of prophecy. I don't even think you understand what's going on between me and Moses as far as the level of prophecy that he has. How dare you speak to him? And then Miriam is punished. And it says that she becomes leprous, which is a sign of death. That's why it's tamei. It is impure. And Moses says to God, how can you make our sister like a child born half dead from their mother's womb? Again, Miriam, who her whole life is about water and sustenance and life and bringing children into the world, it looks bad that she's now looking like a child half dead coming out of her mother's womb, says Moses. Elna Rafanala, oh God, you must restore her health. And that's exactly what happens. And God says, okay, 7 days she'll be outside the camp. Nobody will see what happened. And then she'll come back. But that was the punishment. So all these 5 things relate to the idea of Miriam, the water, life, bringing new life. This is what Miriam is. So the Be'er, which is this sort of miraculous spring that followed the Jews, according to the stories of the Midrash, the tradition of the Midrash in the desert. This is the merit of Miriam. Now, what was it? Well, again, Rashi says that it was like a stone, and the stone used to roll with them. And at a certain point, when they would stop, the stone would stop, and then it was able to produce water for the Jewish people. Now, according to that interpretation, we can understand exactly what's happening here. Now, the people are walking in the desert, and 3 days they don't have water. Now, just understand, 3 days not to have water in the desert, that is bad news. Okay, maybe they still had canteens or wherever their sacks that they were holding the water in, but 3 days without water, that is a near-death experience in the desert. When the elders come over to Moses, they know exactly if they don't speak to Moses now, this could be the end. 3 days in the desert, my goodness. Moses speaks to God, and he wants to know what to do. Now you have to understand, Moses somehow is an unusual human being. I mean, he was at Mount Sinai 40 days and 40 nights. As he says in Deuteronomy, I did not drink any water. I didn't eat any bread. Okay, that Moses could do. But most people, we can't live 3 days without water in the desert. So the elders, in a sense, were totally justified for turning to Moses. This is not just a complaint. This is real taking responsibility and accountability for the people you are leading. They can't continue this way. They will be dropping dead by tomorrow. And then God says to Moses, okay, take everybody together, you and Aaron, and talk to that stone, and it'll give its water. And you will take water out of that stone, and everybody will have water, both the people and their cattle. And Moses took the mateh, his special staff, as God had told him, and he brought all the people together. Now, it's interesting. We have a story like this, too, in Marah, which happened in Parshat B'Shalach in the book of Exodus, the book of Shemot. And it says that the water was very bitter, marim. And Moses put a tree into the water, and they became sweet. Now, if you notice, Miriam, who has to do with the water, is the same letter as the word marim, which is bitter, like in B'Shalach, where the bitter waters became sweet. Even here, when Moses turns to the people, and it appears to be that he's a little bit angry, he says, Shimuna Hamorim, listen, O rebellious ones. The word Hamorim in Hebrew is the same letters as Miriam's name. Morim without a vav is spelled mem, resh, yud, mem, Miriam, the rebellious ones. Again, invoking the name of Miriam in relating to water, whether unconsciously or consciously. So what exactly happened there? So I'll tell you what some of the commentators say based on this midrash. They say that Moses was told, of course, to talk to the rock, and this time not to hit it as he did the first time. And he says, listen to me, O rebellious ones. Am I going to take water out of this stone? Which is, by the way, if he said, am I going to take water out of this stone? Or are we going to take water out of this stone? So basically, he did talk to the stone because he said, this stone, right? And then, of course, he takes his hand and he hits the rock twice, and then water comes out. Now, some of the parshanim, like Rashi and Kuni, say that what happened was he actually spoke to the rock, and the water didn't come out. So he thought, well, maybe I made a mistake. Maybe God said to take the staff because he meant that I should hit it. But then he hit the rock, and again, nothing happened. because it was the wrong rock. Because they're saying that the rock looked just like a lot of the rocks there. It was the wrong rock. And then he realized it was the wrong rock. Then he hit the rock that was actually the rock, which within it was the wellspring of Miriam, and then it gave it its waters. So the way you can interpret the two times, by the way, Rashi, of course, says first there was a little bit of water, there was a lot, but it is possible to interpret it that the first hit was to the wrong rock, and the second hit was to the right rock. Now, what exactly is happening here? And with the rock. And why all of a sudden it says Miriam dies and then there's no water? So of course the Midrash, and Rashi also understands it this way, is that there's no water because Miriam's not around and the rock refused to give water because Miriam wasn't around. So what's supposed to happen when the leader dies and by their merit there is something and it's gone? What is supposed to happen? It's a question of what is real leadership. You see, real leadership is when a leader is able to instill the values and the ideals that they are trying to teach the people, and that the people get it. When the people get it, that is the success of leadership. When a parent wants to bring up a child according to certain values in a certain direction, and the child gets it, and is now an adult and is bringing up their children the same way, that is the successful parenthood. Then you know, hey, everything's okay, because life is not going to last forever, and leaders don't live forever. So successful leadership is when the values are instilled, that the people got the message, and they're going in that direction. Miriam was able to do that, both by example and by the way she interacted with the people, the importance of life, the importance of bringing a new generation, the importance of investing in that generation. The people saw Miriam and they got the point. So now Miriam can go. Now, as we're towards the end of the 40 years, Miriam can pass because the people got it. Well, so what is the rock waiting for? Because Moses now has to talk to the rock, not hit it himself, because now the rock is producing water, not by the merit of Miriam, but the merit of the people who got the idea. But he calls them rebellious. I'm not going to judge Moses. As Rav Chaim ben Attar, the Rav Chaim says, the Bible says Moses had one mistake, and according to all the commentaries, it comes out to about 30, because everybody has a different idea what it was. So I'm not going to try that one. All I'm going to say is that the point here was that Moses was supposed to explain to the people that it's their merit through which the water is out of the rock. And when that happens, Miriam can go on her way. And she died what's called through the kiss, binashika, which means she had no real reason of sin to die. And she accomplished what she had to accomplish. And Aaron, who tried to create unity among the Jews, he was also successful. And because he was successful, now Aaron can go on his way. Because the people understood the message of Aaron, that when you have fights, you have to work them out. We have disputes to work them out. But Moses still has to stick around till the end of the 40 years. And Moses will finally train Joshua to be the leader, who will bring the people into the land. Then he too will go on his way after having instilled in the people new leadership, going to bring them into becoming a nation. Shalom, shalom.